Give you back.
This is so strange to me. Thank you so much. As of this moment, I am a citizen of the United States of America. I don't call myself an American because while it is technically true, there's more to the Americas than just the States. Marielle Franco, Megan Murphy, and I could all be called Americans, even though we were born in different countries. This is my first time in this country, or in this conglomeration of countries. The UK is very interesting, and I hope it can return sometime soon. I think back to this time last May. I was eating dinner with lesbians in Baltimore City. We were planning hypothetical actions, like marching in the Pride Parade, which we actually did the following month. We wanted to cause a ruckus, and a ruckus we did cause. I was personally inspired by the actions of Renee Gerlich and Charlie Montague in New Zealand, and the action of one unnamed woman at the 2018 Vancouver Women's March. I don't think any of my friends wanted to be named, and I didn't either, but I was by someone on Twitter, and thus began my journey into the public eye. This year I went on national television, and I testified in Congress not once, but twice. I was able to do these things not just because of my absurdly true story, but also because my personal privileges of race and education. Not everyone could do what I did. Most of the women on this planet, global majority women, are brown and poor and do not have the kind of opportunities that I have had. Panels like this one, or digital platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, these are incredible privileges. Women who have these privileges need to use them with honesty. So I'm going to be honest. It seems like every day someone new is on my ass, shit-talking my work online. But most of these critics use fake names. Slander really is the weapon of cowards. But I digress. The ideas I share today come from many, many women, because our struggle is ongoing and global. This is not new. We are continuing the work of women long dead. Right now, we are living in a dystopian world of make-believe, where men can be whatever they want, and women can be whatever men want. It's bad. It's bad. And our foremothers saw this coming, but their legacy lives on in us. Now, the legacy of feminism in the United States is riddled with racism. That should not be surprising, considering national history. The women's movement was very white, or at least that's who got the most press and influence. Paula Giddings writes in her book, When and Where I Enter, that in the same year of Martin Luther King's assassination, quote, media attention to the women's movement was concentrated on a bra-burning protest. We could say it was a contest too. It was the bra-burning protest at the Miss America pageant. Yeah. We could do that after the talk if you'd like. I know it's possible to focus on more than one issue at a time, and I think we should. However, the media is influential in shaping public opinion. And when the media is run by white people, you can probably guess what makes the news. In 2015, Baltimore revolted in response to the death of Freddie Gray, a black man who mysteriously passed away in the back of a police vehicle. The Baltimore uprising, just like the uprising in Ferguson 8 months prior, was mischaracterized in the media. The destruction of property got more press than the social and political dissent that these actions communicated. Sometimes violence is the answer. Property destruction can be a political act, so I encourage women, especially lesbians, to become more militant. But violence against people, that's usually not so good. Male violence is a global problem. Men are killing women, each other, and the planet, at a seemingly exponential rate. In the States, men who are usually white use guns to kill people in schools, movie theaters, office buildings, churches, etc., etc., etc. Erica Bridgeford saw this problem of male violence in Baltimore. Instead of lamenting on the internet, she went to the community, spoke with people who had connections to the streets, and challenged men with guns to stop killing. That took guts. More women need to do what she did. Leave the comfort of your echo chamber and get talking face to face. I know you've made great strides here in the UK toward organizing for women's sex-based rights, but in the US, we have a lot more ground to cover. Literally, my country is enormous and travel is expensive. In most major cities, there's maybe one or two or three women who are working offline. I've heard Boston is getting stronger, and there's a few incredible voices in the Midwest and Pacific Northwest states. But everyone else is ruled by fear, plugged into the 24-hour news cycle, filling their minds and bodies with processed garbage. We are so complacent and pacified. I am disgusted. It's almost as if US citizens are afraid of discomfort. We're afraid to think for ourselves. And our educational system is not helping. Public schools are funded by property taxes. Most affluent neighborhoods have good public schools because they pay for it. But if half of your neighborhood is boarded up, your public school is not getting books. Forget about computers. Education is a human right, but my country treats it like a privilege, a luxury. Perhaps because academia is, and has always been, the intellectual militia. People in higher education play popularity games by recycling each other's bullshit. Lots of academics jumped on the postmodern bandwagon to deconstruct notions of power and privilege from atop their ivory towers, when what they really did was deconstruct the English language. Queer theory, it kind of has a similar idea to the radical lesbians' 1970 manifesto titled Woman Identified Woman. The nuclear family and heterosexuality are the same thing, the force and function of patriarchy. Thus, lesbianism is political. But that was twisted around to rationalize worship of the individual rather than analysis of the class. The personal is political because when people come together, we form groups, and groups create culture. We do need to look inside ourselves to some extent. We need to know our own stories and the stories of our ancestors. These stories help us grow. When women talk to each other, especially when lesbians talk to each other and share our stories, we realize we have a lot in common. This is how we raise consciousness. This is how we wake up. We live in a world of make-believe. The beauty industry thrives by telling women we aren't good enough. We're made to feel afraid, inadequate in comparison to others. Celebrities are treated like religious icons, and both are used to sell products. The notion of Santa Claus as a jolly patriarch sipping soda from a polar bear nearby was created to sell Coca-Cola. Most, if not all, of our traditions in the States are capitalist, constructed with the consumer in mind, and femininity is no different. It's artificial. It is expected of women because it marks us as different, as other, as less than man. It makes women into products for male consumption. Femininity hinders our movement. Think about that. Femininity hinders our movement. We have a responsibility to ourselves and to each other to stop painting our faces and shaving our bodies. If we stop doing it, then men will have nothing to mimic. Femininity is a male fantasy anyway. Our bodies are our best weapons, and men know this. That is why they use the church and the state to place sanctions on our bodies, to deny us autonomy. We must take back control. Women must stop allowing men to plug in and drain us. We must use our bodies by ourselves. At the end of the day, our body is all we have. I encourage women, especially lesbians, to get active. Start training. Build your physical strength. Learn a combat sport. Know how to fight before the fight comes to you. And if you already know what the fight is like, then you damn well know why I'm saying what I'm saying. Build connections with women nearby, spend time together, make food, share your stories. For women who are physically disabled, women who cannot practice combat sports, I encourage you to train your mind. We have to make believe our way into a feminist future. Not pretending like the world is any different than what it truly is, but by making strong pockets of resistance. Lesbian community, and even women's community in general, is like a germinating spore. We must nurture and protect this insular seed in the very beginning so that it spreads and grows to something great someday. We need sisterhood for sure, but more than that, we need sisters in war. The revolution starts with you, in your mind. You're going to have to find a way to liberate yourself. No man is going to rescue you. A friend of mine once said, being a princess is a great way to get decapitated. So once you start saving yourself, once you start to stand in your power, other women will take notice. So use what you've got, take what you can from the man. Don't be nice, be something better than nice. Be compassionate, be honest, and say no. If feminism was reduced to one word, it would be the word no. We need to say no to men. No to the male colonization of womanhood. No to the racism that divides us. The planet is dying at an exponential rate. Around 1 million species face extinction, so we need to act up and make moves now. Stormy DeLavier, a Black butch lesbian, challenged her peers to, quote, do something, and that sparked the Stonewall Rebellion. Her call to action was urgent in 1969, and it's just as urgent today. We need to do something because it's now or never. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I slept for like maybe 2 hours last night, so if I nod off or start repeating myself, that's fine, but I'll do my best. So I am really glad that we're talking about the media and news reporting, specifically with regard to the gender identity debate, because this is an issue that makes me super mad. Canada has been a massive disaster on this. And so I think that it's fun for everyone to complain about the media all the time. I think that's a thing that we like to do wherever we are. But I do think that in the UK and in England in particular, you guys are really lucky because there has been really incredible coverage in terms of the gender identity debate. You know, like you have numerous journalists over here who are committed to reporting the truth about gender identity legislation, policy, ideology, and even people who are not, you know, necessarily or obviously biased on this issue, aka critical, are still reporting both sides, or, you know, acknowledging that there's more than one side to this debate, more than two sides even. In Canada, that has not been the case at all. We're very, very progressive and very, very woke in Canada. So we don't like to rock the boat or ask any questions or offend anyone. And we certainly don't value free speech. I do. So we, it's not including me. But the Canadian mainstream media has consistently only covered one side of this debate and pushed the narrative that there are really only two positions that exist with regard to gender identity. So you can either be progressive, liberal on the left, aka, you know, in favor of gender identity ideology, supportive of the idea that it's possible to change sex, or you can be a right-wing Christian bigot. And almost across the board, they've refused to acknowledge, never mind engage with feminist critiques of gender identity ideology and legislation. And, you know, of course, they won't even admit that just regular apolitical people have concerns and critiques with what's going on. When we held the first ever event discussing the issue of gender identity and women's rights in Canada at the Vancouver Public Library in January, the media refused to cover it until protesters began harassing the library to shut it down. The CBC, which is our national public broadcaster, had a radio panel with a few people to talk about the event and what I might say at the event and whether or not what I might say would constitute hate speech, but they didn't invite me to come on the panel. And they didn't, ask me what it was I was going to say. And they didn't even show up to the event to see what it was that I did say, even though they're located literally right across the street from the library. The event was covered in a few mainstream outlets in Canada, but only as a result of the protests, and some of those outlets really just covered the protests. So they covered the protests and then didn't even come inside to watch the event. And then headlines would be that, like a transphobic or anti-trans speaker is speaking at the library. And when somebody emailed the media late on a Saturday night at like 5 a.m., so I assume drunk, using a fake email address that was supposedly my email address. And the email said, "Please be advised, my event has been canceled on January 10, 2019. If you're getting calls regarding it, I have been getting way too," spelled T-O, only one O, "way too many complaints. I have decided to cancel it fully now." And the media ran the story without contacting me to confirm whether or not it was true. It was not true. I did not cancel the event. Our most recent event addressing the issue of trans kids, featuring a panel that included myself and an incredibly articulate, bright, young, detransitioned woman from the US, as well as Dr. Ken Zucker, who ran the Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto for over 2 decades before being fired as a result of a smear campaign by trans activists. The trans activists was attended by 250 people, or 260 people actually, and protested by somewhere between 150 and 200 trans activists. We sent out a press release to every outlet possible in Canada prior to the event, and they completely ignored it. Since I've been in the UK, I've been in touch with several journalists, all of whom have been genuinely interested in and concerned about the issues, questions, concerns, analysis, and so that's to say they're not only covering the issue, but they're covering it fairly and critically and asking really important questions. And acknowledging the fact that feminists have genuine concerns. It's not that we're transphobic, it's that we're genuinely concerned about women's rights. Shocker. So the journalists here are doing their job. In Canada, not a single media outlet has contacted me ever for an interview about my work on this. There's one mainstream outlet that reported on my Twitter ban, despite it being reported across the US. And despite the fact that the reason I was banned was because a Canadian man, I called a Canadian man who tried to sue 14 Canadian estheticians who declined to give him a Brazilian bikini wax heat. This is a Canadian story. Yeah. Canadian media was responsible both for protecting this man's identity, so they kept him anonymous. They did not protect the identities of the women he was trying to extort money out of. They also were responsible for propagating the notion that he was in fact a woman by using female pronouns. No outlet has published coverage of the feminist analysis of gender identity except to smear and label us as transphobic. And in the rare cases they have bothered to contact the other side, i.e. us, the final article has pretty consistently included libel, inaccurate quotes. Reporters have, altered my quotes intentionally, I assume, and misrepresented us, and of course included quotes from trans activist commentators who make untrue statements that are allowed to stand unchallenged. Most often quoted, I don't know if you've heard of this guy, is Morgan Auger. You know him? He's a local man in Vancouver who's responsible for advocating the city of Vancouver cut funding a $30,000 grant to Vancouver Rape Relief, Canada's longest standing rape crisis center. A real progressive guy. Their transition house serves 1,200 women a year and houses 100 women and their children. So definitely a good space to go after for a human rights activist. OJ has been targeting me specifically for years now, in recent months amping up what's become a pretty disturbing obsession with me, essentially threatening to have me charged with hate crimes and thrown in jail for calling men who identify as transgender he. In a Star article about the event in January, the reporter quoted OJ saying that my previous statements and videos spread hatred and discrimination towards trans people, and that I had made false statements about trans people. So by that, what he meant was, again, that I refer to males as he, even if those males identify as she. But the media just kind of goes with those quotes and doesn't challenge them and doesn't ask me for a response. And, you know, he's quoted all the time in the media. So in other words, their go-to spokesperson on trans rights is an unhinged man who harasses, bullies, and libels women like it's his full-time job. This is also a vice president of the NDP, which is our provincial leftist political party. They've never held him accountable for any of this, of course. So, you know, it really blows my mind. It makes me really angry, obviously. You know, literally everything trans activists do is turned around onto us, onto women who are defending women's rights. We're accused of violence, of harassment, of bigotry, hatred, biological essentialism, of being oppressors, and so on and so forth. And it's the most insane Orwellian reversal because, of course, the truth is that this entire movement, trans activism, is based only on lies. It's not about rights. It's not about protecting people from violence or discrimination. It's about forcing people under threat of violence, blacklisting, ostracization, and criminalization to pretend that it's possible to change sex, that there's no such thing as a woman, that women aren't allowed to have boundaries or their own spaces, and that, in fact, women don't even need rights or spaces because they don't suffer discrimination or oppression. They're not a class of their own, and actually it's only people who identify as transgender who are the most oppressed and marginalized people on Earth. This is, of course, insisted upon by the most privileged people on Earth, white, middle, and upper class university students living in the West. As far as I can tell, this movement is mainly about silencing women and centering male voices. This is what feminists mean when they call trans activism a men's rights movement.
Yep.
Trans activism and all this propaganda pumped out by the media supporting the trans activist narrative has enabled and encouraged men to hurl verbal abuse at women, even perpetrate violence against women, as we saw Venice's first event in 2017, of course. It's turned violent threats into progressive activism, which is either ignored or defended by leftist politicians in Canada, by the media, and by so-called progressives. So when we held an event specifically to talk about women's rights at the Vancouver Public Library, we were threatened with violence, as was the library itself. The media did not cover that. They wrote about us as though, you know, we were the ones responsible for the harm. I have friends in Vancouver who I've known for years who, rather than support me and speak out against the disgusting, dishonest, frightening attacks on me, have abandoned and ostracized me as though I'm doing something wrong by standing up for women, the truth, and what's right. Not all of them, but some of them. You know, and essentially it's because they bought into this propaganda. So this is how powerful propaganda is. Like, that, you know, a person that would know me rather than actually have a conversation with me, read what I'm saying, try to engage with my arguments, would prefer to, you know, read what's said about me online and go along with that. Or, you know, just go along with what their friends are saying because there's so much pressure to abandon women who speak critically about this issue. So we're living in a time where women who say women are female are subject essentially to witch hunts and compared to Nazis. And the media is fully culpable in this because they've chosen to report on, I mean, they have the choice to report what's actually going on and who is actually being abusive and violent, who's actually bigoted, who's actually rolling back women's rights and perpetrating harm against women and girls. And they, in Canada, in any case, have chosen to do the opposite, to report lies because it's what's been deemed politically correct. I like to remind people these days, when I do talks, what bigotry actually means, since we're being accused of it all the time. Bigotry is intolerance towards those who hold different opinions from oneself. It is obstinate devotion to one's own opinions and prejudices. So, knowing that, let's look at who is committed not to engaging, not to discussing, not to considering, reading and listening to those with different opinions. Who is committed to their own ignorance to the point that they would prefer to stand outside and chant lies rather than come inside and listen to what we're actually saying, engage respectfully, as we always do, and try to come to understanding. This is a consistent pattern. When I spoke at a university in Vancouver, the University of British Columbia, a group called UBC Students Against Bigotry, and a counter event in response. So they held a protest against me on campus and refused to attend the event to find out what it is I actually think. In response to our event at the library in January, the mayor called me despicable on the news, despite having no idea what my position was, and he certainly didn't attend our event to hear our concerns. Leading up to the event in Vancouver last week about gender identity in kids, protesters stood outside chanting things like, protect trans youth and let kids be kids. Having no idea that this is exactly what we were talking about inside. You know, this is what feminists are advocating with regard to this trans kids issue, which is let kids be kids. And, you know, clearly we're interested in protecting kids from making decisions about things like hormones and surgeries that have permanent harmful repercussions. This practice of protesting or trying to shut down events instead of engaging is defended on the basis that hearing opinions that challenge our own preferred narratives is somehow traumatic. This is something that's been promoted on college campuses. Obviously, this was studied and discussed by Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which I think is very good. I mean, yeah, God forbid you hear an alternate opinion because you might end up agreeing with it and then having to cast yourself out of society. You know, gender identity isn't the only issue in debate wherein students and activists respond this way by plugging their ears or attempting to shut down the conversation. It does seem to be part of a broader trend wherein differing opinions or conversations deemed politically incorrect are treated as some kind of contagion. You know, like thinking critically about our own accepted political positions, ideologies, beliefs, or hearing the opinions of those we presume to disagree with will give us cooties. This kind of anti-intellectualism and refusal to think or understand before forming an opinion is frightening in general. The fact that it seems to originate on university and college campuses of all places is quite appalling because it goes against everything I think universities should stand for. Equally as troubling is the fact that reporters and journalists are intentionally skewing facts. For example, reporting on male violence while using female pronouns because the perpetrator has conveniently decided he's a woman. And again, the fact that these people are reporting only one side of the story and refusing to cover challenges to the trans activist narrative because they know they'll be attacked if they just speak to us, if they just speak to detractors, or even acknowledge their concerns about trans ideology and gender identity legislation. The fact that they're intentionally promoting a nonsensical, regressive, dangerous ideology out of fear is unconscionable. This is not why journalism exists. It does not exist to promote ideology. It exists to hold institutions and powerful people to account and to enable democracy. Instead, the media is discouraging and preventing informed public debate. They're preventing people from coming to educated, rational conclusions and forming opinions based on fact. They are participating in what I consider to be mass gaslighting. So one of the reasons I challenge gender identity ideology is because I think it's regressive, sexist, and nonsensical. I think it limits us rather than allowing us a full range of options as human beings with diverse interests and personality traits. I think it puts forth an incredibly rigid understanding of gender and treats biological material reality as something intangible, subject to youthful whims and hair dye. I also think it has incredibly negative impacts on women's rights in particular. And I think that it's important that when enacting legislation and making sweeping changes to policies that impact women and girls, we should be having a conversation about it and engaging in rigorous public debate. What we're losing is quite serious. Women fought for rights in their own spaces in order to ensure they could participate in public life free from harassment and abuse, and so that they could live their lives as autonomous beings. And I don't know how we can possibly defend women's rights in spaces if there's no such thing as a woman, or if anyone is a woman, regardless of whether or not they have a female body. The reality is that, of course, we can't. And while everything feminists fought for over centuries is dissolved within only a few years, the Canadian media is turning a blind eye and calling their propaganda and chosen ignorance progress. It is shameful, and I guarantee that in a decade or two, we'll all look back on this, not only with regret, but with remorse. And just as we look back at McCarthyism, the witch hunts, and the Holocaust, and wonder how society could have let this happen, we'll look back at trans activism and what we did to women and girls under the guise of political correctness and wonder why so many people went along with it.